Can you believe that 3,000 years of unparalleled majesty, power, and monumental insanity emerged from nothing more than a strip of mud barely wider than a highway? This is the story of a civilization that should never have existed, born in the blistering throat of the Sahara Desert, surviving only by mastering a violent, unpredictable river god we call the Nile. This is not history as you read it in a textbook. This is the truth of the impossible empire, where the line between mortal man and deity was so thin it could be snapped by a single catastrophic flood. We are talking about the moment the world held its breath and watched humanity attempt the unthinkable, building paradise in hell itself. A catastrophe no one saw coming was the constant existential threat of nothingness. Before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, there was only chaos, heat, and the slow, grinding march of the sands, swallowing every trace of life, leaving behind only desiccated bones and whispers of forgotten gods. Imagine a time, roughly 5,000 years ago, when the people scattered across that great, unforgiving landscape were fighting not for wealth or conquest, but simply for the next harvest. They were fragmented, desperate tribal groups huddled near the river, surviving solely on the terrifying mercy of the inundation. The Nile was not the benevolent provider of modern tourist brochures. It was a beast, sometimes withholding its waters until starvation gripped the land, sometimes swelling into a furious, unstoppable tidal surge that erased villages and swept away generations of toil. Every year was a terrifying gamble against divine indifference. They had two worlds. The upper land, the fierce, mountainous regions of the south, and the lower land, the sprawling, treacherous marshes of the delta in the north. Two cultures, two ways of life, perpetually locked in a bitter, bloody struggle for dominance over that thin sliver of fertile ground. It was a time of petty kings, of local warlords, each dreaming of controlling the Black Earth, Kemet, and pushing back the Red Desert, Deshret. But to truly conquer the Nile, to forge an empire that would defy time itself, required a level of ruthlessness and vision that seemed utterly beyond human capability. Then, seemingly overnight, a force emerged from the south, a figure so terrifying and efficient that his name would echo down the millennia, becoming synonymous with the very dawn of Egyptian identity. The man who would drag Egypt kicking and screaming out of the darkness of prehistory and into the blinding light of dynastic rule. The iconic palette of Narmer, one of the earliest artifacts we possess, doesn't show a gentle transition of power. It shows a king, immensely powerful, standing over his enemies, ready to deliver the final crushing blow, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, signifying his total, violent mastery. When he united the two lands, merging the white crown and the red crown into the double diadem, he didn't just create a political entity, he forged an ideology. He declared that chaos, Isfet, was defeated, and order, Ma'at, was henceforth the law of the land, protected by the divine mandate of the pharaoh. This unification was the geopolitical earthquake that launched civilization. Suddenly, the isolated pockets of power combined their resources, their genius, and their labor into a single, terrifyingly efficient machine. And what did this newly unified, desperately fragile kingdom decide to do immediately? They decided to build things that were physically impossible. they didn't start small. They didn't settle for modest temples or defensive walls. No. The very moment they achieved stability, their ambition became utterly monumental, a defiant gesture against the fleeting nature of life. Within a few generations, the Old Kingdom would burst onto the global stage with an architectural fervor that beggars belief. This was the moment they stopped simply surviving and started building monuments designed for eternity, laying the foundation for the age of the God Kings. The sheer, unbelievable audacity of the Step Pyramid of Djoser, then the colossal, geometrically perfect Great Pyramids of Giza, the largest structures built by human hands for thousands of years afterward, was the immediate, staggering result of Narmer's unification. They transformed stone into mountains, not to house the living, but to preserve the dead, defying the inherent fragility of the human condition and staking their claim on the heavens. This was ancient Egypt, the grandest show on earth, built on mud, blood, and the monumental certainty that they could conquer death itself. But beneath this gilded perfection lay constant threats: civil war, the return of famine, and the relentless pressure of maintaining Maat against the ever-present shadow of chaos. The story of Egypt is the story of this perpetual, thrilling battle, which begins now, with the impossible ascent of the first true God King. How did they achieve this impossible feat? And how long would this divine order last before the first catastrophic collapse tore the two lands apart again? Brace yourself. The sand is shifting, and the Pharaohs are rising. We left the vast, indifferent desert staring down the audacity of man. This was not a slow evolution. This was a sudden, violent incubation. Before the Pharaohs, there were the Nakada, desperate clusters clinging to the treacherous ribbon of the Nile, each generation fighting for the right to exist in the sun-baked inferno. The chaos was absolute. The river itself was a weapon, oscillating between catastrophic flood and deadly drought, threatening to swallow their meager harvests whole. These proto-Egyptians understood one fundamental truth: individual survival was suicide. Only massive, coordinated effort could tame the beast. Thus, the first seeds of centralized, tyrannical power were sown, not out of greed, but out of necessity. They needed a single, ruthless hand to manage the flood, to track the stars, and to tell 1,000 laborers when and where to dig the crucial irrigation channels. This desperate need birthed the warlords and the first proto-kingdoms of the pre-dynastic era. The culture that succeeded, the Nakada III, was an engine of conquest, learning rapidly how to organize labor, smelt copper for lethal weapons, and build the first true temples dedicated to holding back the cosmic terror of Isfet, chaos. Their ambition was terrifying. The land fractured into two immense warring entities. The south, known as Upper Egypt, a brutal, rocky landscape ruled by the fierce patronage of the vulture goddess Nekhbet. Their power base was built on strength and the sheer vertical thrust of the desert cliffs, harsh and unforgiving. Then there was the north, Lower Egypt, the wide, marshy, fertile delta where the Nile finally surrendered to the sea. Guarded by the venomous cobra goddess Wadjet, they possessed the wealth of the Mediterranean trade routes, but their territory was softer, less defensible, built on the shifting silt of the swampy delta. For centuries, these two halves were locked in a death grip, a civil war predating recorded history itself. Two crowns, two ideologies, both convinced they alone held the key to Ma'at. The entire destiny of the Nile Valley hung on which warlord, which proto-king, would prove strong enough to consume the other and finally declare himself the singular master of the flood and the sun. The tension was unbearable. A silent buildup of military might along the invisible, arbitrary border near modern-day Atfi. Every skirmish, every raid for grain or gold, was a rehearsal for the final, bloody scene that would forge the first true empire under the iron fist of a single, unifying conqueror. And then, the moment arrived. From the desolate, relentless south, a figure emerged from the dust cloud, a warlord whose name would echo through 3,000 years of history, Narmer. His campaign was not diplomacy. It was absolute annihilation, a violent crusade to enforce order. Picture the scene, eternally etched in stone on the Narmer palette. Not merely an artifact, but a chilling declaration of divine right enforced by the mace. There he stands, impossibly tall, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, grabbing the helpless king of the north by the hair, ready to deliver the final, crushing blow that sealed the fate of a fractured land. He took the red crown of Lower Egypt and smashed it symbolically onto the white crown of the south, creating the dual pshent, the ultimate symbol of the two lands welded together by sheer, unstoppable force. He wasn't just a king. He was the physical embodiment of the unity principle, the living bridge between the two cosmic halves, the first true pharaoh. Narmer, or possibly his direct successor Menes, established his new capital at Memphis, the legendary White Walls, deliberately placed at the very pivot point, the junction where the desert met the delta, declaring that from this point forward the divisions of man were irrelevant. Only the unitary will of the pharaoh mattered. But unification was only the opening act. Keeping this enormous, volatile state together required a miracle of logistics. Narmer and his immediate successors, the ferocious rulers of the First and Second Dynasties, collectively known as the Early Dynastic Period, faced a terrifying existential challenge. How do you manage a territory stretching hundreds of miles with no modern communication? The answer was revolutionary, yet deeply tedious: the birth of the professional Egyptian bureaucracy. Scribes, the true architects of eternity, were unleashed across the land. They standardized weights, measured tax burdens, tracked the precise level of the Nile inundation, and most critically, they invented history itself. Through their precise, elegant hieroglyphs, they codified the language, transforming disorganized sounds and local dialects into unbreakable, universal commands from the God-King. These were the tools of eternity, the instruments that turned temporary military conquest into permanent, self-sustaining statehood. They didn't just record taxes, they recorded the divine will. Every harvest, every soldier, every shipment of copper from the hostile Sinai Peninsula was logged and accounted for, all flowing back to the singular, terrifying power sitting in Memphis. The foundation was the soft Nile mud, but the structure of this eternal civilization was built from the relentless, obsessive dedication to record-keeping and administrative precision. It was this boring, meticulous grind that allowed for the subsequent, unimaginable leaps in architecture and engineering that would soon shock the world. This early dynastic era wasn't about great pyramids yet. It was about the brutal, necessary grind of ensuring that Ma'at, the divine order imposed by the mace, could be maintained by the papyrus roll. These early kings, Jer, Den, Ka, were obsessed with cementing their legitimacy, often through terrifying acts of ritualistic power, including the continued practice of elaborate, brutal human sacrifice to accompany the deceased pharaoh into the next life. They were establishing a terrifying precedent. The king was not just mortal, he was the gateway to immortality, and the price of that gateway was absolute obedience. With the state apparatus solidified, the two lands finally fused, and the system of divine kingship firmly in place, the stage was set for the Age of Wonder. The pharaohs, having mastered the Nile, now looked upward, determined to challenge the heavens themselves. The terrifying instability of the early dynasties was giving way to an unprecedented period of sustained peace and unbelievable wealth. What would the god-kings build now that they had solved the problem of earthly survival? The answer was coming, rising straight out of the desert sand: the Age of Stone Giants. The impossible kingdom was about to enter its golden, immortal phase. The impossible kingdom had finally stabilized the chaos. The Nile, once a fickle monster, was now a predictable provider. But the god-kings looked past the fertile black earth, up toward the indifferent, eternal desert sky. They had mastered the material world. Now they aimed for the heavens themselves. This shift in ambition marked the true beginning of the age we remember. It was the moment the pharaohs decided that if they were to rule forever, their tomb could not merely contain their body. It had to be a rocket launch pad, a staircase to Osiris, a permanent physical manifestation of Ma'at itself, anchoring the cosmos to the Nile Valley. This required an engineer, a sorcerer, a genius of terrifying vision. His name was Imhotep, and his arrival tore the fabric of architectural history into a million pieces. In the court of Pharaoh Djoser, in the Third Dynasty, stood a man whose mind was so far ahead of his time that he was later deified. Imhotep, vizier, physician, astronomer, and chief sculptor, looked at the traditional flat-topped mastaba tomb and sneered. Mud brick? For a god? Unthinkable. He saw the desert not as a destroyer, but as a quarry. He initiated the largest construction project the world had yet seen, commanding countless laborers to haul vast quantities of limestone from Tura. He was not just building a tomb, he was inventing stone architecture on a monumental scale. What rose at Saqqara was not a building, it was a declaration of war against mortality. 6 colossal steps, stacked one upon the other, creating the world's first known major stone structure. The step pyramid was 200 feet high, a terrifyingly geometrical mountain of white stone, a colossal, permanent ladder built for Djoser's soul to climb out of the earthly dimension. It proved that the pharaohs could literally reshape the earth. But Djoser's pyramid was merely the prototype, the explosive proof of concept. The true, perfect form was still elusive, waiting for the king who would sacrifice everything for geometric perfection. The Fourth Dynasty arrived, and with it, Pharaoh Sneferu, a man whose obsessive ambition bordered on madness. Sneferu was not satisfied with steps. He demanded the perfect, true pyramid shape, the image of the sun's descending rays made solid. He wanted 4 flat sides meeting at a single celestial point. His first attempt was at Medum. He began by converting an earlier step pyramid, adding casing layers to smooth the sides. But his engineers, still mastering the physics of such colossal weight and angles, failed catastrophically. The outer casing collapsed in a cataclysmic landslide, burying thousands of years of work under a mountain of rubble. It was a humiliating, terrifying failure, a physical manifestation of Ma'at momentarily yielding to Isfet, chaos. Undeterred, Sneferu moved on. His next project, the Bent Pyramid at Dashur, demonstrates the sheer panic of his engineers. They started the structure at an aggressive, steep 54-degree angle, but as the weight mounted, the interior chambers began to crack and shift, threatening another disaster. In a desperate, split-second decision that defines the terror of managing a cosmic construction project, they suddenly changed the angle midway, flattening the slope to a safer 43 degrees. The result was strange, distorted, and magnificent, a monument to human error and engineering humility, forever frozen in stone. Still, Sneferu was not finished. He needed perfection. His third and final masterpiece, the Red Pyramid, also at Dashur, was built from the start at the safe 43-degree angle, rising 341 feet into the air. It was the first true, geometrically perfect, smooth-sided pyramid. Sneferu, in his single reign, moved more stone than any pharaoh in history, perfecting the divine geometry that would define his era. He had built 3 colossal monuments, not one, just to ensure he had a safe landing spot in the afterlife. But this was only the prelude. The stage was set for the man who would take this geometric obsession to its absolute limit, Khufu, son of Sneferu. Khufu did not merely want a staircase to the stars or a stable geometric tomb. He wanted an eternal mountain, an anchor so massive it would resist the entropic decay of the universe itself. He demanded Giza. The Great Pyramid was not just a bigger version of his father's work. It was a qualitative jump into the impossible. It demanded a level of centralized control, logistical precision, and belief that defies modern understanding. Imagine the logistics. 2.3 million massive stone blocks, some weighing upwards of 80 tons, quarried and transported, hauled up colossal ramps using nothing but human muscle, rope, and profound organization. This was not slave labor in the traditional sense. This was a nationalized faith project, an entire kingdom mobilized by the promise of eternal Ma'at. The sheer manpower required to feed, house, and coordinate 20,000 to 30,000 highly skilled workers year-round for 2 decades dwarfed the construction effort itself. The pharaoh was not just a builder. He was the ultimate supply chain manager, ensuring bread, beer, and housing flowed smoothly across the desert floor. When completed, Khufu's Great Pyramid stood 481 feet tall, a structure so overwhelming that it would remain the tallest man-made object on Earth for the next 3,800 years. Its sides were faced with gleaming white Tura limestone, polished smooth, designed to reflect the sun like a beacon across the desert. It was a machine designed for immortality. But the pyramid was not just a pile of stone. It was an astronomical device, precisely aligned with true north, its shafts pointing towards critical stars like Thuban and the Belt of Orion, the celestial home of Osiris. The entire Giza complex, the Sphinx, the causeways, the subsidiary pyramids, was a meticulously engineered, massive theological map, a perfect reflection of the heavens laid out on earth. Khufu had achieved the impossible. He had made the temporary permanent. The Old Kingdom had reached its zenith, a moment of such pure, centralized, and religiously fueled power that it seemed the kingdom would indeed last forever. But such monumental centralization, such terrifying expenditure of resource and faith, always creates invisible structural cracks. The foundations of the eternal kingdom, ironically, were about to be severely tested. The sheer, impossible weight of the Giza projects, the relentless extraction of the nation's soul to feed the divine kings, had hollowed out the core of the state long before the last block of Tura limestone was laid. For 4 golden centuries, the pharaoh had been the sun, the ultimate source of all life, law, and cosmic order, Ma'at. But as the glorious 5th dynasty bled into the 6th, a chilling and irreversible transformation was underway, a structural collapse invisible to the peasant pulling the plow, but terrifyingly clear to the priests guarding the royal treasury. Enter Pepi II, or Neferkare, a child king who ascended the golden throne around 2278 BC, and then, impossibly, refused to leave it. His rule, spanning perhaps 94 years, an almost unimaginable duration for any human being, let alone a monarch, was not a blessing of divine stability, but a creeping, suffocating sclerosis of the state apparatus. The pharaoh, meant to be the youthful, vigorous manifestation of Horus on earth, grew old, then ancient, then utterly remote. His once absolute authority dissolving into the arid air like a forgotten prayer. While the pharaoh slept through his near-century-long rule, the regional governors, the mighty nomarchs, were wide awake and consolidating their terrifying power. They had been entrusted with managing the nomes, the administrative districts, and rewarded for their loyalty with lavish land grants, accumulating vast personal wealth and influence. Crucially, these vital positions, once revocable gifts dependent entirely on the royal whim, began to solidify, evolving into hereditary fiefdoms passed ruthlessly from father to son, utterly outside the centralized, weakening grip of Memphis. The power vacuum at the core was rapidly and violently filled by these provincial warlords, men who now commanded their own local garrisons, amassed their own armies, and, most damningly, began redirecting vital tax revenue and agricultural surpluses away from the royal coffers. They started building elaborate, private tombs in their home territories, mimicking the pharaoh's eternal monuments, a blatant, stone-carved declaration of their newfound independent sovereignty. The Old Kingdom, designed as a single, unbreakable monolith aimed squarely at eternity, was fracturing into dozens of fiercely independent mini-states, each preparing for the inevitable, bloody confrontation that history was about to demand. But the final, brutal shove that sent the kingdom crashing down came not entirely from human betrayal, but from the cosmos itself. The Nile, the very lifeblood that had birthed and sustained the civilization, the constant upon which all of Ma'at depended, suddenly betrayed them. Scientists now confirm a devastating global climatic shift, known today as the 4.2 kiloyear event, coinciding precisely with the terminal decline of the 6th dynasty. For decades, the annual inundation, that glorious, predictable flood that fertilized the Black Land, grew weak, then meager, then terrifyingly non-existent. The result was instant, total catastrophe. The granaries, once overflowing symbols of divine provision, emptied with frightening speed. Famine, not a localized hardship, but a national plague, stalked the parched riverbanks, devouring the social contract whole and stripping the population of their sanity. The carefully maintained order of Ma'at, the cosmic justice upheld by the pharaoh's power, vanished overnight, replaced by the primordial, savage reality of chaos, Isfet, which finally broke through the fragile walls of civilization. What followed was the First Intermediate Period, a terrifying 150-year epoch of unimaginable suffering that Egyptian scribes later described with apocalyptic horror and existential despair. We have preserved fragments of this collective nightmare, texts like the admonitions of Ippur, detailing a world turned utterly upside down. Behold, he who possessed clothes now stands naked. The poor are eating the children of the rich. Laughter has perished, and grief walks the land. The meticulously planned irrigation canals, once the arteries of the empire, fell into disuse and were choked by mud and neglect as the state's maintenance infrastructure dissolved. People fled the delta, driven mad by hunger, turning on their neighbors in desperate, brutal territorial skirmishes over scraps of viable land. Egypt was now a landscape of walled, fortified cities and desperate garrisons, a nightmare scenario where every nome fought every other nome for control of the dwindling, precious resources. The central government at Memphis became a farce, collapsing entirely under the weight of its own irrelevance. Dynasties rose and fell in quick, ephemeral succession. The 7th and 8th dynasties were little more than ghosts, brief flashes of powerless royalty, often ruling concurrently with other claimants in the south and north. The divine pharaoh, still nominally sitting on a cracked throne, was reduced to a hollow figurehead, a symbol of a forgotten age, while the true power resided in the provincial capitals of Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes far to the south, both flexing their muscles for the ultimate showdown. The great pyramid builders, the masters of eternal stone and flawless mathematical order, had failed to build a lasting human system. The centralized, monolithic power of the Old Kingdom had imploded, replaced by the bitter, savage realization that even the gods could be starved into silence. The abyss had swallowed them whole. After 4 centuries of sublime, godlike rule, the great edifice of the Old Kingdom, that monumental testament to eternal order, had not merely collapsed, it had evaporated into the dust of anarchy and starvation. This was the First Intermediate Period, the Age of Despair, where the very river that birthed their civilization turned into a merciless, mocking tyrant. The Nile, usually the bringer of life, now barely offered a trickle, its catastrophically low floods starving the vast populations that had grown too dependent on the centralized granaries of shattered Memphis. Nomarchs, those powerful provincial governors, who were once mere servants of the distant pharaoh, now carved the carcass of Egypt into petty, blood-soaked fiefdoms, fighting endless, meaningless wars over grains and grazing lands. The absolute concept of Ma'at, that divine cosmic structure imposed by the pharaoh, shattered entirely. The gods walked away from their temples, and men realized, with chilling clarity, that they were utterly alone in a hostile, chaotic universe. The trauma was existential, ripping the veil of guaranteed safety from the Egyptian psyche. The heart of the struggle crystallized around two centers of brutal power: Heracleopolis, holding the sacred flame of the north, claiming the legitimate, if fractured, mantle of the Memphite kings, and further south, deep in Upper Egypt, the emerging desperate power of Thebes. These were not political debates settled by viziers. They were protracted, devastating sieges and raids that bled the country dry for over 100 years. Imagine a land where every village was a fortress, and every journey outside the walls was a gamble with the axe or the spear. The royal court of Heracleopolis, known as the 9th and 10th dynasties, ruled with an increasingly paranoid iron fist, attempting to maintain control, but their authority rarely extended beyond the sight of their own city walls, making them vulnerable, isolated, and ultimately doomed. But in the Deep South, a new lineage of calculated, cold-blooded ambition was being forged in the desolate wilderness. The 11th dynasty, centered at Thebes, a city that was, at this point, a virtual unknown, destined to become the undisputed nerve center of imperial ambition. Under the early leaders, the Inyatefs, these southern warrior kings slowly and mercilessly chipped away at the chaos, uniting the southern nomarchs through a mixture of terror, compelling political marriages, and, crucially, a unifying promise, the sacred life-or-death promise of Ma'at restored. The hero who finally dragged Egypt back from the brink of total extinction was Nebhepetri Mentuhotep II, a man whose name, chillingly, translates to "Montu is satisfied," a direct reference to the aggressive, powerful Theban war god. His campaign was not swift. It was a decades-long endeavor of relentless military pressure, culminating in the decisive conquest of Heracleopolis around 2055 BC. When the smoke cleared, the northern king deposed, and the land finally reunified, the psychological landscape of Egypt had been permanently altered. The gods were no longer aloof, guaranteed protectors. They were fierce, demanding entities whose favor had to be earned through constant action, suffering, and intense statecraft. Mentuhotep II marked his earth-shaking triumph by building his mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahari, a staggering fusion of architectural styles that looked back at the grand pyramids of the Old Kingdom, while daring to innovate with massive terraces carved directly into the colossal limestone cliffs. This violent reunification did not usher in a return to the naive, simple faith of the pyramid builders. Instead, it birthed the Middle Kingdom, often called the Classical Age of Egypt, a period defined by intense philosophical introspection, profound state-sponsored cynicism, and dazzling literary output. The scribes of this age produced works like the devastating Instructions of Amenhotep and the profoundly dark Admonitions of Ipuwer, texts that lamented the chaos and warned future generations that order, Ma'at, was not a divine guarantee, but a fragile, man-made illusion, requiring relentless vigilance. The pharaoh himself changed dramatically. He was no longer the distant, inaccessible god-king of the 4th dynasty. He became the shepherd, the warrior, the struggling leader burdened by the trauma of the past, forced to earn his legitimacy through administrative competence, ceaseless labor, and military prowess. The true, brutal consolidation of this new, hard-won order came under the 12th dynasty, founded by Amenemhat I, a man possibly of common or non-royal origin who seized power violently and moved the capital from chaotic Thebes to a strategically safer central location, Ichtawi, Caesar of the Two Lands. Amenemhat I knew that the unchecked power of the nomarchs was the cancer that had fatally consumed the Old Kingdom, and his entire reign was dedicated to systematically dismantling their power base, often through cunning political maneuvering, espionage, and sometimes through outright, chilling assassination. He even wrote the Instruction of Amenemhat, a terrifying political testament to his son Senuseret I, warning him that even those closest to him in the night could be traitors, demonstrating the profound paranoia that fueled this new, highly effective, and deeply cynical regime. But the zenith of Middle Kingdom power was reached under Senuseret III, a pharaoh whose very image conveyed a weary, determined strength. Statues depict him with furrowed brows and heavy-lidded eyes, the weight of the kingdom, the memory of the famine, permanently etched into his face. Senuseret III was an expansionist titan, focusing his military might relentlessly south into Nubia, a land rich in gold and resources crucial for financing the restored imperial treasury. He did not merely raid, he conquered and established a formidable chain of massive, imposing mud brick fortresses along the Second Cataract. These fortresses, like Buhan and Semna, were structures of almost unbelievable defensive engineering that projected Egyptian military power deep into Africa. The hard, brutal evidence that the lesson of the FIP had been learned. Weakness invites immediate destruction. Egypt would never again allow its borders to crumble. Furthermore, the entire administration was overhauled. Instead of relying on local nomarchs, a new, massive, centralized bureaucracy, a professional, state-controlled civil service, was established, overseen by the vizier, designed to ensure that the pharaoh's will reached every inch of the land, entirely bypassing regional warlords. This new administrative machine was perhaps the true heart of the Middle Kingdom, operating with Swiss watch precision, gathering taxes, managing the vital irrigation cycles, and ensuring the stability that the previous age had fatally lacked. The Middle Kingdom was a miracle of resilience, the ultimate proof that Egypt could be dragged back from the gates of hell by sheer brutal will. It was the age of the common man finding his place in the afterlife, the age of sophisticated art, and the age of the supremely competent warrior king. But even this perfect machine of order, founded on trauma and fueled by ambition, carried within it the inevitable seeds of its own exhaustion. No kingdom built on relentless centralization and military expansion can remain eternally stable, especially when the memory of the famine fades. The relentless pressures were quietly building. External forces were watching from the deserts and the Levant, and the memory of the chaos, though recent, would eventually fade, leading to a dangerous complacency that would set the stage for the next, even more terrifying collapse. The second great night of Egypt, the next devastating intermediate period, was waiting just beyond the hard-won horizon, ready to swallow the fragile peace whole. The fragile shield of Ma'at, so painstakingly forged by the warrior kings of the 12th dynasty, began to corrode from the inside out. For nearly 200 years, Egypt believed it had achieved the impossible, eternal stability. But stability is a myth invented by those too comfortable to see the shadows massing on the horizon. The great reservoir of royal power, centralized in the heart of Thebes, started to leak, slowly at first, then cascading into a torrent of administrative chaos. The later kings of the dynasty were shadows, pale reflections of their mighty ancestors. They inherited a perfect machine but lacked the iron will required to maintain its terrifying complexity. Nomarchs, those powerful local governors, began to taste the forbidden fruit of independent authority again, strengthening their regional garrisons and diverting the vital river taxes that fueled the central government. The 13th dynasty was not a unified reign. It was a desperate, panicked scramble for the throne, a dizzying carousel of ephemeral pharaohs, ruling sometimes for months, sometimes for mere weeks. They barely maintained control of Upper Egypt, while the fertile delta, the gateway to the Mediterranean world and the most vulnerable border, was slowly slipping into anarchy. The ancient Egyptians, obsessed with maintaining their perfect isolation, had failed to account for one fundamental truth. The world outside was moving, evolving, and arming itself with terrifying new technology. They were about to discover that the desert was no longer a shield, but a highway for the armies of cosmic disorder, ready to exploit the slightest crack in the pharaoh's authority. They had forgotten the lessons etched in the tombs of the Old Kingdom, the warnings of Pepi and Merikare. When the center weakens, the edges collapse, and the enemy watches with ravenous eyes. The slow internal rot was the dinner bell for the unimaginable catastrophe that was about to descend upon the Nile Valley, erasing centuries of hard-won peace in a single brutal generation. And then the invaders came. They did not creep across the desert boundaries. They burst through the delta like a supernova, a chaotic storm of unknown peoples later mythologized and remembered by the Egyptians as the Hyksos, the rulers of foreign lands. This was not a slow infiltration. It was a hostile takeover executed with brutal efficiency and terrifying technological superiority. They poured in from the Levant, Semitic peoples driven by famine or ambition, carrying secrets of warfare that Egypt had never conceived of. Imagine the sheer terror, the Egyptian foot soldier armed with his copper axe and simple bow, staring down the barrel of history's first great technological leap in combat. They were facing the future, and the future carried a scythe. The Hyksos brought the horse and the chariot, a twin terror that turned the flat, predictable battlefield of the Delta into a slaughterhouse. Their composite bows, layered in laminated wood and sinew, could pierce armor at ranges the simple Egyptian self-bow could only dream of achieving. The very foundations of Egyptian military doctrine crumbled in a matter of months under this mechanized blitzkrieg. The unthinkable happened. Ma'at was not just challenged, it was utterly defeated, stomped into the mud of the Nile banks. Egypt was partitioned. The Hyksos established their capital at Avaris, deep in the delta, seizing control of the crucial trade routes and the most fertile land, imposing a foreign tyranny. For the first time in history, the two lands were ruled by foreigners. The Nile itself became a boundary of deep, bitter resentment, dividing the occupied north from the humiliated south. The legitimate Egyptian pharaohs, now reduced to mere regional princes, were forced to retreat southward, huddling in the ancient city of Thebes, clinging desperately to the memory of kingship. They were vassals in their own kingdom, compelled to pay tribute to the barbarian kings whose names echoed strangely in the halls built by Khufu and Senusret. This humiliation was the deepest wound Egypt had ever suffered, a psychic trauma that would define the next 5 centuries of its existence, sparking a furious desire for vengeance. The Hyksos rule, centralized under kings like Apophis, was surprisingly sophisticated but relentlessly foreign. They adopted Egyptian titles, learned the sacred writing, and even worshipped Egyptian gods, but they never shed their core identity as conquerors. They controlled the ports, the gold mines of Nubia, now cut off from Thebes, and the vital supply lines that fed the southern heartland. Meanwhile, in Thebes, the 17th dynasty was born, a desperate line of patriotic princes clinging to the remnants of national pride. They lived under the long shadow of avarice, constantly plotting, constantly fearing the day the Hyksos chariots would roll south to finish the job and extinguish the flame of Egyptian sovereignty forever. This period, the Second Intermediate Period, was a silent, simmering war of attrition. The Theban princes, lacking the resources to fight directly, began an intense spiritual and military reformation, honing their resistance in secret. They were learning the invaders' secrets, studying the chariot tracks, and preparing for the inevitable, bloody confrontation that would decide if Egypt would ever again belong to the Egyptians or remain a conquered prize. The war machine of Thebes, fueled by sheer incandescent fury, was slowly being constructed in the deep south. They began to breed horses, craft their own composite bows, and master the terrifying speed of the chariot, knowing that only by adopting the enemy's weapons could they survive the coming storm. They knew that Ma'at could only be restored through raw, violent action, through the sheer force of a divine right reasserted. The long night of foreign domination was drawing to a close, and the dawn would be smeared with blood. A new line of pharaohs, fierce, unforgiving, and hardened by generations of shame, were about to emerge from the sand-swept isolation of Upper Egypt. Their goal was simple, yet monumental: to drive every last foreign foot soldier back into the unforgiving Asian dust from whence they came, or die trying. The stage was set for the great era of empire, born not of peaceful prosperity, but of existential rage. The blast radius of their unified fury was immediate and absolute. The hated Hyksos were not just defeated, they were surgically excised from the delta, their memory scrubbed from the temple walls like a cancerous blight, a lesson in cosmic vengeance carved by the hands of Ahmose, the liberator. But the pharaohs of the rising 18th dynasty understood a terrifying truth that would forever shatter the great sleep of isolation. The chaotic foreign threat was an eternal, recurring nightmare. They recognized that Ma'at, the cosmic order they cherished, could no longer be maintained simply by guarding the cataract borders. Ma'at demanded proactive violence. It demanded the absolute relentless subjugation of every potential enemy that dared breathe within 1,000 miles of the sacred river, turning defense into domination. This seismic shift heralded the birth of the Egyptian Standing Army, a professional, mechanized weapon of unprecedented scale and logistics, financed by the desperate need for security and the thirst for tribute. No longer a ragged militia of levied farmers, this was a disciplined force, built on the harsh, brutal lessons learned during the desperate siege of avarice. They adopted the very tools that had nearly destroyed them: the powerful, lightweight war chariot, the composite bow that could pierce leather armor at unthinkable range, and a relentless focus on siege warfare and battlefield maneuvering. The pharaohs stopped being benign gods in boats. They became supreme commanders, encased in bronze-scale armor, leading charges into the burning desert heat, embodying pure martial rage. Ahmose had secured the valley, yes, but it was his successors, the giants who followed, who would prove that Egypt's survival depended not just on resisting invasion, but on launching preemptive wars that shook the foundations of the entire known world. The blueprint for empire began, as always, with gold. The first target of this terrifying new military machine was the south, the legendary land of Kush, or what we now call Nubia. This wasn't merely a punitive raid or a border skirmish. This was an economic imperative, a desperate grab for the keys to the Egyptian vault. Nubia held the colossal reserves of gold that flowed like liquid sun from the Wawat and Kush mines, the lifeblood of the empire. Gold was the oil and the currency of the ancient world combined. It paid for the loyalty of nobles, funded the construction of the colossal Karnak temples, and ensured that Egypt's diplomatic communications were always backed by the undeniable weight of massive, terrifying wealth. Without Nubian gold, the New Kingdom machine would grind to a halt. Thutmose I, a true warrior king, drove the boundaries south beyond the treacherous Fourth Cataract, an incredible logistical feat that pushed Egyptian control deeper into Africa than ever before. He carved his victory steel onto rocks that watched the furious rapids, proclaiming Egyptian dominion over the very stars, forcing the Nubian chiefs to pay tribute in human capital and precious metals. With the south ruthlessly secured, the focus swung violently north, across the Sinai hellscape, into the fragmented, politically complex landscape of the Levant. This region was the historic gateway for every major invasion, the perennial soft underbelly of Egypt, and it was here that the true, magnificent empire would be forged in fire and blood. The pharaohs were no longer content with mere vassal states that might flip allegiance when the wind changed. They demanded direct, suffocating control, installing Egyptian garrisons and administrators into key coastal cities, forcing local rulers to send their eldest children to Thebes. These children were euphemistically called students, but they were, in chilling reality, hostages guaranteeing their father's perpetual obedience. This rapid, aggressive expansion brought Egypt into direct, terrifying conflict with the other great emerging power of the age, the Mitanni Kingdom, based in northern Syria and Mesopotamia. The Mitanni controlled the crucial trade routes and were, critically, masters of the war chariot, the defining weapon of the era. This was not a fight against disorganized, desperate tribes. This was a clash of titans, two monolithic empires staring at each other across the vast plains and the banks of the Euphrates River, daring the other to blink, knowing that only one could ultimately dictate the terms of regional fate. The pinnacle of this martial fury was reached under the reign of Thutmose III. His name should echo across the millennia as the ultimate military genius of the ancient world, the man history would later call the Napoleon of Egypt, a figure who transformed aggressive defense into total, relentless domination. After seizing the throne from the incredibly long, peaceful shadow of his stepmother, Hatshepsut, who had focused on trade and internal building, Thutmose III erupted onto the geopolitical stage. He launched a stunning series of 17 highly organized military excursions in 19 years that turned the Near East into an Egyptian parking lot, establishing dominance through sheer, overwhelming force. His greatest triumph, the defining moment that showcased the sheer audacity and strategic genius of the new kingdom, was the Battle of Megiddo. The rebellious Canaanite princes, heavily backed by Mitanni influence, had fortified themselves in that strategic mountain city, ready to choke off Egypt's northern access. Thutmose III, against the terrified advice of his veteran generals, chose the narrow, dangerous Aruna Pass, a defile where his entire army could be slaughtered by a handful of archers to surprise the enemy. It was a move of terrifying, divine risk, a gamble only a god king could make, relying on speed over safety. The ensuing battle was a total, surgical rout. Thutmose III encircled the enemy forces, driving the shattered remnants back into a brutal, humiliating 7-month siege within the walls of Megiddo itself. When the city finally fell, the plunder was so vast it choked the treasuries of Thebes, nearly 1,000 chariots, mountains of bronze and gold, and thousands of captives. He didn't just win a battle. He secured the entire Levant for the next 2 centuries, creating an imperial boundary that stretched from the Fourth Cataract in the deep south all the way to the banks of the mighty Euphrates itself, deep within Syria. Egypt was no longer a kingdom of the Nile. It was a global, terrifying superpower. It had crushed chaos, not by prayer, but by the relentless, organized, and godly application of overwhelming military power. The empire had reached a plateau so magnificent, so wealthy, that the very sun itself seemed to pause over the banks of the Nile just to admire the spectacle. For a century and a half, the pharaohs had treated the entire Near East as their personal bank vault, draining the gold of Nubia and the tribute of Syria into the gaping maw of Egypt's central authority. This was the age of Amenhotep the Magnificent, the true apex predator of the ancient world. If Ramses II was the legend, Amenhotep III was the reality of untouchable, luxurious power. He didn't need to fight. The kings of Babylon, Mitanni, and even the menacing Hittites sent him their daughters and begged for gold in return, addressing him in terrified deference as the Great King. Thebes, his royal capital, became the first true metropolis of human history, a golden city of unparalleled architecture. Karnak was already an inhuman forest of columns, but Amenhotep III built the magnificent Luxor temple, dedicated not just to the gods, but to his own divine essence. He wasn't merely a representative of Amun, he was Amun, embodied in flesh and diamond-crusted chariots. The wealth was so staggering that it warped the very concept of value. The diplomatic correspondence of the era, later unearthed at Amarna, reads like a series of increasingly frantic pleas from lesser kings, all desperate for Egyptian gold, calling it the dust of the earth in Egypt, a cheap commodity that flowed like water from the south. Amenhotep III was too secure, too successful, too comfortable in his self-declared divinity. He focused on building, hunting, and maintaining the delicate, terrifying balance of power across the globe, secured not by the relentless clash of bronze, but by rivers of gold and the sheer, overwhelming weight of reputation. But prosperity breeds fatness, and fatness breeds internal rot. While the pharaoh enjoyed unprecedented peace and luxury, a dark, silent struggle was escalating back home in the smoky, incense-choked corridors of Thebes, a conflict that threatened the very fabric of the cosmos. The threat was not external, but internal, spiritual. The priesthood of Amun at Karnak had grown monstrously wealthy and powerful on the backs of the empire's success, transforming from mere caretakers of a god into the shadow government of the world's superpower. Every conquest, every tribute payment, every temple built, every prayer whispered, it all funneled incredible resources and political leverage into the hands of the high priests. These were men who served the god, yes, but who increasingly saw themselves as rivals to the living God on the throne, controlling access to heaven itself. They were the custodians of the traditional order, the relentless defenders of Ma'at as they defined it, and they were ready to choke the life out of any pharaoh who strayed too far from their established profitable doctrine. The living pharaoh might find himself suddenly replaceable if Amun's earthly servants felt slighted. Then, into this gilded cage of luxury and quiet theological warfare, stepped the son of Amenhotep III, Amenhotep IV. He was not the warrior king his ancestors were. He was an intellectual, a theologian, a poet, and perhaps the most dangerously radical man ever to sit upon a throne forged by conquest. He looked at the suffocating, bureaucratic power of the Amun priesthood. He looked at the sprawling, complicated, demanding pantheon of Egyptian gods, and he saw not stability, but weakness, corruption, and spiritual theft. He had a vision, a terrifying, simple, singular vision that demanded absolute obedience. He would not just reform the priesthood, he would annihilate it. He would tear down the entire religious universe of ancient Egypt and replace it with one terrifying singular entity, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun itself, giver of life, and nothing more. This was not merely a change in worship, it was a cosmic revolution of the mind. It was the direct rejection of every single sacred tradition that had held the Egyptian state together for 2,000 years. It was an attack on Ma'at itself, an invitation to chaos, orchestrated by the very man sworn to uphold order. His first move was the renaming. He shed the hated name of his father, the one that honored the god he sought to destroy, and proclaimed himself Akhenaten, effective spirit of the Aten. The world shuddered, sensing the breaking of the celestial covenant. His next move was an act of pure, magnificent insanity, displaying an authoritarian will unlike any before or since. He ordered the construction of an entirely new capital city, a virgin site in the middle of the unforgiving desert, far from the influence of Thebes and the toxic grip of the Amun priests. He named it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, today known as Amarna. It was built with staggering speed and shocking efficiency, a tribute to the revolutionary fervor that consumed the young king. Akhenaten wasn't just moving house, he was attempting to reset the clock on all human civilization. In the old temples, gangs of fanatical workmen, authorized by the pharaoh himself, systematically defaced every monument bearing the name of Amun, chiseling and chipping away the sacred hieroglyphs, attempting to erase the memory of the great god from the very stone of Egypt, thereby destroying his power. This was treason of the highest order, an act of spiritual terrorism against the established order. The priests, the nobles, the terrified populace, they watched as their god-king, once a guarantor of stability and tradition, became the greatest source of existential instability the nation had ever faced. while Akhenaten stood rapturously singing his beautiful, haunting hymns to the solar disk, neglecting the essential duties of international diplomacy and military maintenance, the hard-won empire, stretched thin across the deserts of Syria and Palestine, began to crack. The vassal kings, sensing weakness, divine displeasure, and realizing the pharaoh's focus was elsewhere, stopped sending tribute. The mighty Hittites, waiting in the north like geological pressure, began to move aggressively into Egyptian holdings. The letters streaming into Akhetaten grew desperate, detailing the loss of cities, the betrayal of allies, the collapse of entire regions. The pharaoh ignored them all. He was focused only on his singular, crystalline god. He had traded the real, messy, organized power of the empire, the divine application of force, for the pursuit of perfect, divine, monotheistic truth. And in doing so, Akhenaten allowed chaos to flood back into the world he was born and failed to protect. When the pharaoh Amenhotep IV decreed that the sun disk, the Aten, was the one and only true god, the ground beneath Egypt's ancient pillars did not just tremble, it shattered. He was not merely rebranding a deity, he was executing a hostile takeover of the entire religious-industrial complex that had governed the nation for 2 millennia, triggering the most profound political and spiritual crisis the Nile Valley had ever faced. The priesthood of Amun, based in their opulent, gold-plated fortress at Karnak, was the shadow government of Egypt, wielding immense wealth and influence that often eclipsed the pharaoh himself, protected by centuries of unquestioned sanctity. Now, with a single stroke of the royal stylus, their entire universe was declared heresy, their gods stripped of divinity, and their vast estates nationalized, an act of sheer audacity that demanded total, violent compliance. The king's fanatical zealots were unleashed upon the land, tasked with the horrifying labor of damnatio memoria, the total obliteration of the old gods. Hordes of sculptors and masons were dispatched to temples and tombs across the breadth of Egypt, armed with chisels and mallets, their mission to systematically hack out the name and image of Amun from every inscription, every pillar, and every sacred monument. This was not theological debate. It was the physical cleansing of history itself, a desperate attempt to excise the memory of the divine father of the new kingdom. Imagine the terror of the common peasant watching as the symbols that had guaranteed the Nile's flood and the sun's rising for generation after generation were smashed into rubble, plunging the spiritual life of Egypt into sudden, horrifying darkness. To truly escape the suffocating grip of Thebes and its entrenched, rebellious hierarchy, the pharaoh, now renamed Akhenaten, effective spirit of the Aten, commanded the unthinkable, a total abandonment of the ancestral capital, the city of Amun, Waset. He ordered the construction of a brand new city, pristine and untouched by the poison of the old gods, rising out of the desolate sands halfway between Thebes and Memphis. This city, Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, was built with maniacal speed, an almost frantic expression of his singular, tyrannical vision. It was a place designed not for the colossal, dark halls of traditional temples, but for open-air worship, where the king and his royal family stood directly beneath the blazing, scorching rays of the Aten, acting as the sole divine intermediaries between humanity and the light. No citizen could approach the Aten directly, All prayers, all offerings, all spiritual sustenance had to pass through the filter of Akhenaten and his great royal wife, Nefertiti. The power structure had been inverted and consolidated. Where before the power of the gods was distributed among thousands of priests, now all divine authority resided solely and absolutely in the person of the king. And the art. For 1,500 years, Egyptian art had been a rigid, codified language of eternity, where every muscle, every posture, every angle spoke of immutable, divine perfection and idealization. Suddenly, under Akhenaten's chilling edict, the stone carvers were forced to depict reality, or at least a dramatically unsettling, distorted version of it.